All right, cool. We're going to get back into some coding today. Still looking at building some forms for the web, something that I really love working on. So let's look at what we got. We've got a form that's sending a post method to some API endpoint. Cool. Something I want to play around with is let's see. I want to compare this default behavior of the get versus the post submission. So let's run that. Cool. Port should be listening. Oops. Sorry, I want to go. Let me bring this down actually. Over there. Nope, wrong port. Okay, cool. There's our form. Looks good-ish. And what we want to do is just submit something and see how this network request sends the form payload in the URL parameters. All right, so what happens when we change that, to a post request? And we go back, reload, and we just send some data, we submit it, still sends it, but now we're getting an error. 415, unsupported media type. We still see the payload is working correctly, so the actual post request is fine. It's just a matter of the backend not supporting application xwww form URL encoded. And the reason why we're getting that is because that's the default way or method of sending data with a form, but the backend doesn't support it. So let's fix that real quick. I'm going to go here and then what do we want? We want to pull up our code over here. And what we need is a way for Fastify to receive that form data, which it currently does not support. So we want to install a package called Fastify form body, so that we have access to the form body, if that isn't obvious enough. And I think that might, well, let's start with that. Okay. Cool. So let's import that. Fastify form body from Fastify form body. We're going to register that. Cool. Thank you. Thank you. And now let's try that one more time. So now we are sending it. We're supporting sending form body requests. We're supporting being able to accept it. That's great. Now what I want to do is be able to receive that data. So in my API endpoint, I basically want to come here and say console log request body, and let's see what this looks like. Test, submit the form. We go back to our server console, and we see that we've got an object with a name and test. Great. That's awesome. So now why don't we say we're just going to respond with that. I think that's good enough for now. Cool. Name. Got it. Sweet. So now our form is probably sending that information. Something else I kind of want to play around with or just look at is when we go in HTML, we may not want to have this submit button there. And then we can just hit test and enter, and that should send it. Cool. Problem with doing things this way. A good example is like if we have like a search input, we may not want to show the button. And the reason is because, I don't know, search inputs with a button are not sexy or something like that. So what we probably want to do in that case is have like a class equals visually hidden and have the button there anyway. I don't have a CSS file set up, so I'm just going to put this in here and say style visually hidden. And can, well, I can never remember it. So thank you, GitHub Copilot, for having my back here. We hit save, go back to our form, we reload. So the reason why we want to do this is because if a user comes to our form, they're using like a screen reader or someone that relies on the keyboard, and they're inside of a form. The form button, the submit button there, is a real solid clue that you're at the end of a form. Otherwise, you might have something like this. Nowhere. In a situation like this, with the button there, we can see that when I tab through, there's a stop in between when I'm in the form, when I'm on the submit button, and to where I've exited out of the form to the next tabbable element. If the button was not there, the experience is a little bit more jarring. Imagining that you're not visually looking at this form, and you tab, suddenly you're in a form, and then you tab again, and next you're on a link. Now, you could have a link embedded within a form, but this is not one of those cases. Like, for example, a link to a privacy policy that you have to, have a checkbox checked in order to submit the form. The problem here is this is not part of the form. This is content after the form, and it wouldn't be a very cohesive experience. So we're going to go back to saying that we have a button. That's just an example if we wanted a visually hidden button. I don't think I actually want that right now. So let's get back into it. There's our form. It's going to submit. It's sending our data with just HTML. Our backend is receiving that data. I'm going to turn some music up. There you go. It's a little bit too loud. Cool. Okay, what's next? We are submitting our form. Our backend is receiving our form just fine. We have access to the form body. Cool. Next thing's next. Let's go back to submitting it with JavaScript, shall we? Okay, so in JavaScript, what do we have here? Whoa, I don't know what all that is. Oh, I'm not ignoring node modules. That's fine. In JavaScript, we have this JavaScript form submitter that says if it's a GET request, we're going to send the data as URL search params. Otherwise, we're going to send it as JSON. And in fact, I don't want to do this because this JSON is going to behave differently than if we send it as a form. I want them to behave as close to the same as possible. So let's look at this, right? Now JavaScript's going to submit it. We don't get the page reload. We do get the request. We see the payload. And the response is that. So let me look here. The headers. What do my headers look like? Request headers. Content type text plain. I think that's probably doesn't match what a form looks like. So what we actually want our form to do to have the right what I want to have the right submission. Let's see. I think now that it's handling form bodies, I don't need this JSON stringify anymore. I can actually send that as just the search parameters. So here on a GET request, we're updating the URL.search property. And on a post request, we are sending data, the search parameters in the body of the request. So let's look at what that looks like. Okay, so this is great. This is what I want. Because instead of sending a JSON string in the body, we're sending URL search parameters. The browser will actually automatically update the content type of the request and set it to application URL or form URL encoded. And this is great if we want to maintain that sort of behavior parity between HTML and JavaScript. So now we're submitting the form with JavaScript, but it's behaving as if it was submitted with HTML. And why do we want that? Again, it's so that we can build one endpoint that can handle either JavaScript or HTML form submissions and behave the same. And the reason we want that is because in the event that JavaScript in my application fails, I still want my web app to fall back to something that works, which is HTML, which is great. Okay, what's the next part here? We probably want to test some different input types. Do I want to do the hard part first or the easy part first? let's do a different input type. So, okay, go into HTML. We've got standard text input, right? Oh, what were you going to tell me? Email, huh? That's still kind of a text input. So the next one I want to do is maybe like type equals checkbox. Do you like do you like Bedrow? Sure. Thanks, GitHub Copilot. Okay. We're going to do a checkbox, and then we're going to do the one that I know is going to cause an issue, which is, well, not quite yet. Let's do text area with the name of text area, ID of that. I'm going to leave this all the same. This is going to be text area. Tell me why. Sure, dot, dot, dot. And then we're going to do one more label for file. Yes. ID file, name file, type file, cool. All right. Let's go back to turning JavaScript off. So now what we want to do is see name. Do I like Bedrow? Yes. It's not real. And then I should probably make sure that got some safe things to upload. Let's go with the function call logo. I'm going to drag that onto this file input. And then I think I can submit this form. Man, why is this saying drop har files here? I know. How do I fix this? I guess that works. Cool. Let's submit that form again. We saw the request. It's being handled by our backend at /API. It's a post request. We have access to the payload, but here's the weird thing: is the text field works as expected. The checkbox sends the text string of on. The text arrays is not right, but that's sending its content. And then the file is sending just an object of file. So let's actually open this up as well. I want to, on my server, log request.body conslog console.log. Okay. Let's go back, submit the form one more time, check out our console. And what do we get here? I don't think this is, yeah, that wasn't working right. Okay, so our request body comes in and we get a name, which is a string of name, checkbox, which is a string of on, text arrays, which is a string of it's not real, which is correct. But then the file is just a string of the file name, which is not quite what we want. And the reason is because our form the request headers, I don't think that's quite right. Let's try this one more time. Let's also fix that text area thing. Text areas. Text area. Thank you. Let's go here, reload that. Name, Austin. Do I like Bedrow? Check. Because, and then we're going to choose a file. We'll choose this function call logo. And then we are going to submit this form. And it's still saying URL form encoded content type. But in fact, I don't think that's actually right. I think if we were to catch that request before the route change, we would see that it is, in fact, a multi-part form data. And why is that relevant? Okay, so the reason why it's relevant is because in order to send binary data, such as files, your form, that's right. Because I'm not doing this right. In order to send files in your form, you need to modify the enc type. So let's go ahead and do that. Enc type equals multi-part form data. That's going to allow us to upload a file and send it. Then we can go back. Boop, 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 boop. Oops. We can go back here, reload that. Yo, yes. We're going to choose our file over here and submit this form. There we go. That's what we were looking for. Once again, we get a 415 unsupported media type, and that is because our content type here is multi-part form data. Now, if you want to send files anywhere with HTML forms, you need to set the enc type to multi-part form data. And you need your API to be able to support that file type. So let's look at fixing that. We go to our server. Fortunately, once again, Fastify has this solved pretty well. We can stop that. We can say npm install Fastify multi-part. That should do it. npm run dev ought to get us sorted. Then in our code, we want to say import Fastify multi-part. Oh, you were there a second ago. Multi-part from Fastify multi-part. Cool. Then down in our plugins, I want to say we register Fastify multi-part. Fastify multi-part plugin does take an options object. So here we want to add this flag to add to body. That's going to allow the existing files to be added to the body that we're trying to access down here in the request body. Okay. Let's go back to our thing and submit one more time. And now it was pending, and now it looks we got a successful response. Looks like we got the buffer for our entire file, which in retrospect was probably not the best idea to respond with. But that's cool. Now we're getting a 200 okay. It's not going to let me view that, is it? No. That's okay. We can see that it's working. Cool. So now let's re-implement that part with JavaScript enabled. So how do we do that? Right. So we basically right. So something that we can do is we can, instead of saying the options.body is search parameters, we can send it with this form data thing here. So now let's go back here. Let's reload. Test. Let's add our file here. And when we submit the form, we can see that our request was sent. And it was sent with multi-part form data. And that's interesting because with the fetch request, we actually haven't set our request headers. So when you use this form data object, it's going to modify the fetch request content type and automatically set that to multi-part form data. So that's really important to know, because if your backend doesn't support multi-part form data, or if you don't want to send multi-part form data for whatever reason, you probably don't want to reach for just passing form data as a request body, even though you can. Let's look at what that response looks like. Cool, it looks like it's working. So how do we again keep that feature parity or behavior parity between JavaScript and HTML, where if I submit an input, or if I put a form with a bunch of inputs and send that data, it uses application www URL encoded, unless the enc type is set, which is how you would have to send data on a standard form. I don't know if that even makes sense, but basically what we want to do, what we want to do is this: is we want to modify how we set the body of the request based on the form's enc type. So we can say form dot enc type, which I don't know why it's not. Oh, right. It doesn't, TypeScript doesn't know that this is a form element. So let's do this really quick. The type is HTML form element. Cool. Now that we've done that, I can see I've got my enc type available. If my enc type equals what is it? If my enc type equals, right, multi-part / form data, then I want my request body to be the form data. Otherwise, I want to use the search parameters. So if the form's enc type is set to multi-part form data, we'll send it with the form data object so that it automatically sets that header to multi-part form data. If the form's enc type is not multi-part form data, we'll send it as a search parameter so that it uses the default HTML style content type headers. Hope that was clear. And I think that is, well, that's just about it for submitting the form, because the last thing I'd say we probably want to do is, well, form.reset. That way everything kind of clears out. Austin, I do. Yes. Yes. That is how I tell you why. And then we'll grab this function called logo. Hit that on there. Submit the form. Cool. The request was sent. We probably actually only want to do that on a successful request. Oops. So how do we do that? I think we don't want to do that here. Then we can console log the response. And if the response.ok, cool. On successful submissions, we reset the form. On unsuccessful submissions, we can say sure, error response status text. This is probably not what we would want to do right away, but that'll do for now. Okay, what's the next step? Our form is submitting correctly. Next thing we want to do is tackle form validation, probably. Okay, I'm going to clean up this form a little bit. So I think we've settled the file thing and the different input types. Let's have a name and email. Nah, actually, email's kind of a pain. Let's have throw a number in there. We'll say type equals number. All right, type equals number, and let's make that a little bigger. What I want to do with validation, right, is I want to say that this first one is required, and I want to say that this one is also required, and the min is 5. Cool. So if we look at our form now and I try to submit it, this is what the default behavior is going to be with JavaScript. Well, with JavaScript enabled or disabled, is it's not going to trigger that submit field. So what's it going to do? It's going to, when I submit the form, it's going to highlight the first invalid input, and then it's going to tell me something about why it's invalid. So let's solve that with JavaScript as well. Now, the first thing I probably want to do is not show this validation message. So in order to do that with JavaScript, what do I need to do? Right. Okay, so I'm going to disable JavaScript for now. And then if I want to prevent this form from doing this validation check in order to submit, I can do that with HTML. I can come here and I can say no validate. Now, if I try to submit this form, it's actually going to submit my data. And I can see that my data is going through empty, which is fine. Can't stop someone from doing that anyway. However, I probably don't want to do that because I want to progressively enhance this form, meaning if JavaScript is available, I want to use JavaScript for the validation. And if it's not available, I want to fall back to HTML for the validation. So I definitely don't want to do, that. And instead, what I'm going to do is go to my client-side JavaScript. I'm going to re-enable this now. I'm going to go to my client-side JavaScript, and I'm going to say, hey, form, I want your no validate to be true. I wonder if this knows that it's a form element. Yeah, it does. Cool. Okay, cool. So now we go back here. Our JavaScript should have run, which means our HTML form should have no validate to true, which if we run this, if I disable JavaScript and rerun it, we can see that JavaScript is disabled. JavaScript's not running. Form does not have no validate. This Java enable JavaScript. Run that again. Now JavaScript runs. It adds the no validate to this form. That's not going to be quite enough because now if we no validate and then submit, our network request is still going across, right? We don't want this behavior now. We want to actually prevent our network request from happening when our form is invalid, which currently it is. So how do we do that? Let's go back here and we can say on the submit event, we can say if the form.checkValidity, if the form is not valid, then we can say something like console log no, and then we can do something like return early. We can return early so that this code never gets run. If this block gets run and we return, this will not be run. Cool. Let's do that. Our JavaScript runs. Our form has no validate. We hit submit. Something happened. What happened there? Oops. My JavaScript should be running. Ah, I know what happened. We submit, we console log no, and then we return early, but we don't ever prevent default behavior. Cool. Let's go back and try that again, and we get no. Okay, that's looking good. Now what we want to do is the other default behavior that the browser does when JavaScript is disabled is, oops, right, reload that. JavaScript is disabled, is it goes to the first input and highlights it. So let's redo that. So what do I want to do? Down here, I want to say form.querySelector. I only want to get the first element, so I don't need query selector all. And what I want is an invalid, the first invalid element, and I want to focus on it. Let's redo that. Submit the form. There we go. Oh, right. I still have JavaScript disabled. Enable JavaScript. Reload the page. Submit the form. There we go. We have our current error handling. We have the focus going to the first invalid input. And that's okay so far. There's one gotcha here, maybe you caught, and that is here. We want to make sure that we're doing some good testing on our form. So what if we said something like label for Linux, input type is radio. Name is OS, value equals Linux. And then we're going to go cool, right? So what we want to do here is say, what is your favorite operating system? And I say, I guess, Windows, walls, just kidding, Mac OS, Mac OS. So we've got Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, right? And we're going to say that one of these is required. I think I did that right. Okay. That's really annoying. So I'm going to go... Cool. Windows, Mac OS, Linux. This is required. This is required. These are required. So I submit now. Let's try disabling JavaScript. Refresh and submit. We highlight that, right? We fill that out. We submit. It highlights this. Fill that out. Oh, it submits that it needs to be value greater than 5. And then we submit, and it's going to say, please select one of these options between Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. If we enable JavaScript and we reload and we submit, we highlight the first one. We don't have the message yet, but that's okay. We highlight the second one. We're going to say that's 8. We submit again. And that works as expected. However, this is probably not the most accessible way of writing this syntax. What I'm going to do instead is wrap it with a field set. I'm going to wrap this with a legend. So now these are all related inputs. I'm going to go back here, reload. I think I want to disable JavaScript again. Reload here, once again, blah, blah, blah. There, once again, we throw in a number. Submit the form there. Once again, it highlights that first one. And now, I really wish I could just recall the same previous command. Okay, now we got our JavaScript version of validation. We've got our error consoling. We've got our first invalid input highlighting. We've got our second invalid input. And what happened there was I click submit, and now we have different behavior than we had before. Why is it highlighting this form? And it is logging. I don't know. Or if you were trying to do this the first time, you may not know, but I actually do know. And the reason is that we are looking for the first invalid element and then focusing on it. And in fact, field sets can be entirely invalid or entirely disabled. So what we want to do is target the first invalid element that is not a field set. So now let's try this again. We submit, we get the first one. Cool. We submit, we get the second one. Cool. We submit, we're back to our first little radio button, which is perfect. That so far currently matches the default browser behavior for validation. The only thing missing now is the error messages. So now the question is, how are we going to handle that? So there's a number of ways to handle validation messages. And I think that the default browser behavior is actually not great because, as you can see, if nothing is filled out and everything is required, there's no way to show, at least the browser doesn't show, what is required and what isn't. We can do that with some content, obviously. We can say like this field is required, this field is required, whatever. But effectively, a common pattern is to show people as they go through and start making mistakes what their mistakes are. So I'm not going to do the browser default of when I validate a form, I highlight the first input and only show what's wrong with that input. I'm going to validate every input when you hit submit and show you what's wrong with all of them. So, how do I want to do this? Essentially, I want to go through, let's start by going through all the inputs. So let's see, first things first, I'm going to make a constant up here that is input tags equals input text area select. Cool. And put text area select. That should be fine. We're going to come down here and we're going to say form dot query selector all for our input tags joined by commas. That's how I'm going to capture all of them, but I am going to put that inside of a for of loop. Input of all right. Okay, we're missing one thing there. And then what do I want? I want to create a function to validate each input. Okay, how do we validate this input? We're going to say first thing we're going to do is say input. Input is an input element. It has an ugly way of doing it. Huh. Node list of that. That's weird. Okay, well, that was weird, but that got me what I wanted. I don't know why it works with an array but not a node list, but either way, we get what we want here. So we get the validity state. And then essentially what we want is if the input is not valid, input is not valid. I basically want to create, well, how much time have we got? Let's just check this out. We submit the form. Cool. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inputs. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 validity states. If we look at the validity state, we can see if it's valid, if there's a type mismatch, too short. What is the problem here? Value missing. So that is mapping to the required field. So let's do a little bit of this, right? Value missing. I know that that's an error I'm going to want to have somewhere. So let's say errors equals an array, and we're going to say errors.push value is required. Cool. Next, we can say if pattern mismatch, right? That's kind of an annoying one, but value is too large. This is actually not quite what I want. I want to automate some of these error messages. So the pattern mismatch, I don't think we're going to be able to do anything about because I don't know what the pattern is supposed to be. That's basically when we pass a regex, which is not for today's episode. But let's say if the range underflow, then we want to say errors.push value range. Well, that's cool. Thank you, GitHub Copilot. Range overflow means you went over the input max value. If the range is underflow, value is too small. And step mismatch. I don't want to do the step mismatch. What I do want is the type mismatch. So it's not the expected type of input.type. And then let's go down here and say, so we're going to log all the errors we've got. Cool. I'm going to do one more here for email. That's going to be name, type of email. Okay, so now let's clear all that and let's refresh and let's submit this form. And we get all of these are value is required. Now, the problem with, or the difference here is that required, if you don't have anything in there, you're not going to trigger some of the other fields. So now we're saying value is not the expected type of email, which is good. That's working. So now the hard part is going to be pushing these errors onto our form, automatically, which I think is something that's going to have to wait until tomorrow. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. We looked at keeping feature parity and backwards compatibility when creating forms with HTML that are submitted with JavaScript, both from an HTTP request perspective, so adding fetch to the form to send the data, and on the server side, setting up the server so that it can receive forms that are submitted with HTML, forms that are submitted with files that have the ENC type of multi-part form data. It's a lot that goes into building forms that are resilient. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you like the show. Let me know if you want me to keep doing this sort of thing. I'll be around again, answering questions and stuff. So feel free to hit me up in the chat.